Hi there, and welcome to the Princeton Biopartners podcast. Princeton Biopartners is a strategy and consulting firm with a deep specialization in integrated evidence generation planning. I'm really pleased today to introduce our guest speaker, Andrew Rosen. Andrew Rosen is a global medical affairs leader and a renowned fraud expert in the field of evidence generation. Andrew, really pleased to have you on the podcast. Do you want to just briefly introduce yourself?
Absolutely. Thanks, Dylan. Thanks for having me. I'm Andrew Rosen. My background is a PhD in neuroscience. I've been in the biopharma industry for about 11 years now in various roles within medical affairs. I've worked in field medical affairs, in evidence generation with a special focus on integrated evidence generation planning, and also have quite a bit of experience in real world evidence. And it's an exciting time to not only be part of this industry, but to be in a role that focuses on evidence generation.
Brilliant, Andrew. And we're really excited to kind of unpack the key topics we have in the discussion today. The first that we'd like to touch upon is just around, computational genomics and how that's, reshaping the way that we approach the evidence generation landscape. So the first question I'd like to ask is, how are AI and computational genomics reshaping the evidence generation landscape?
Yeah, it's a very exciting time for medicine and for the biopharma industry. And there's a real symbiosis between the two. What I find most exciting and probably will be the most dramatic change in the coming years is a shift from reactive medicine to prevention. And AI and computational genomics are paving the way. We're at a point now where genomic data is now cheaper to produce. A whole genome sequence scanning could be anywhere from a few $100s to $1,000. And AI is more accessible than ever. So when you put genomic information with clinical data and artificial intelligence, you have some really powerful tools coming forward that will enable risk stratification, the detection of the earliest signs or risk of disease, and intervention at a point that will spare the patient years of suffering through a disease. It will increase longevity. It will lessen the burden on healthcare systems. And I think it's critical for biopharma companies to keep this in mind and be good partners in driving this revolution in AI and genomics forward so that we can continue our strong focus on patient care and delivering the best possible outcomes.
Andrew, any organizations that you feel are really spearheading this effort?
I think that every organization now there's an opportunity for every organization to start investing in this. And I think it's critical that they do. And by it, I'm referring to real world data, AI, and computational genomic information is really
Mhm.
relevant to every single disease state. Whether there's a single gene that's driving a hereditary monoallelic disease, or you're looking at something that's more general that relates to the synthesis and composite of hundreds of thousands of genes, that information can lead to earlier detection, earlier intervention, more personalized care. So it
Mhm.
really should be something that's a focus for every organization, regardless of the disease state that they're focusing on. I'm reluctant to call out specific companies because I think there are so many
Yeah.
that are doing this really well, but it's an obvious trend that there's an attention that's turning toward this, not in an academic way, not in a purely intellectual or modeling only way, but in a really pragmatic way. And we could talk about what's working and where there are still uh, barriers and bottlenecks to work through.
Yeah, super interesting, Andrew. And I know that, given the way that we're moving, especially in diagnostics, this is an incredibly important area. Let's say that, you were looking from an organizational level to start this from the ground up. How does that look like? I mean, is this a matter of really carving out a specialized team, or does it sit within an existing framework within the organization?
I think the barrier to entry is pretty low. It doesn't have to be a tremendous investment at first, although I don't want to diminish the cost and energy and expertise that goes into this. The way to begin is to start assessing the needs of the organization, to consider what data resources you have on board, what evidence gaps you think are still challenges to the organization, as well as the physicians and patients that are of interest that you're focusing on. And then to purposefully invest in data assets that can address these data gaps. So things like real world databases, either claims databases that have diagnostic and treatment codes, therapeutic codes. There are EMR based assets that can provide a different view on the health of the patients. And then, of course, there are specialized individuals to begin onboarding either as consultants to your organization or as full-time employees. And I'm referring to individuals that have a strong understanding of coding, although that's becoming more accessible now, of computational genomics and real world data methods, of epidemiology. These are all critical individuals to continue to be better and better in providing care for patients, in understanding risk stratification, in understanding personalization of care as far as providing a therapy at the earliest possible time point and not considering the patient and the disease to be equivalent. There are many opportunities to personalize care based on the specifics of the patient, and those variables are accessible in the data. So there's a lot that you could do with it. And when you start pairing real world data, AI, genomic information, or multi-omic information, it's really powerful. And we're starting to see some incredible applications. And I do believe it will revolutionize medicine in the coming years.
Wow, really, really thoughtful insight there, Andrew. And again, with this question, feel free to take it where you will, and we can modify it. But I'd be interested in understanding what are you doing in computational genomics, and maybe learning a bit from your direct exposure to this area would be really helpful for the listeners.
Yeah, it's interesting. On the one hand, I focus on a disease that has a single gene basis, at least the hereditary version. So it's easy to settle there and understand mutations of the single gene and how they contribute to the pathogenesis and how disease pathophysiology as well as the clinical course differs based on this mutation. And we know there are about 140 or so mutations of this one gene. It's called TTR and it encodes the protein transthyretin. But beyond that, there are risk factors that lie in hundreds of thousands of different mutations that can allow us to predict whether or not these pathogenic mutations will be penetrant, perhaps, how frequently perhaps a patient should be evaluated for the disease if we know that they harbor this mutation, if they are a carrier, potentially what the clinical course might look like, and potentially what therapy might be best. So it's easy to fall into the trap that there's a single and simple solution. But the truth of the matter is every patient is different. And we are now at the point where we can begin thinking about risk stratification and prevention of the disease, leveraging genomic data. And that's a real mission for the company that I work for, as well as for, I think, the industry in general. There's a trend toward moving to preventive care. You don't want to intervene when the patient has very advanced heart failure. Often that's the reality, but it's best to treat as early as possible and spare the patient years of suffering, of healthcare resource utilization, hospitalizations, mortality. All of these things might be avoidable should you intervene at the earliest possible time point.
I love that, Andrew, and it really brings home the importance of this field for the patient benefit. Early intervention is key, and I think we're seeing a lot of organizations lead the front there, and regulatory frameworks become a lot more conducive for that. So look, let's move on into the bread and butter, right? I love IEGPs, you love IEGPs. Andrew and I had the pleasure of collaborating on a really important integrated evidence generation plan. God, this was in 2022. I mean, 4 years has just gone by like that. But Andrew, I really wanted to dive into how you feel like IEGPs have evolved over the course of time. Let's say maybe say the past 5 years when that integrated component really became a focal point. What do you think differentiates teams that do these IEGPs now well versus those that have, room to grow?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think for starters, there are still many organizations that don't do integrated evidence generation planning. So if you are part of an organization that is interested in building an IEGP or have made this a core of your evidence strategy, you're way ahead of the game. So I do think there's a trend towards seeing this more often across organizations, and we're starting to refine tactics in building IEPs and the use and where this goes. But it's a very worthwhile investment to start thinking critically about how you're building evidence plans and doing things tactfully rather than reactively. I think that in general, evidence generation plans used to be these siloed plans, as siloed as the functions that were advancing them. And now, and this is really the essence of the integrated evidence plan, is making sure there's cross collaboration, communication, and a culture of psychological safety to express differences, to debate, to communicate regularly, and to collaborate on a plan that's reflective of the mission of the organization. Something that any function can look at and see their imperatives reflected in that plan, something that's unifying. And that's the essence of the IEP, is building something that serves many purposes and reflects many functions, but at the same time is singular and advantageous to the organization and the patients that we serve.
Andrew, you mentioned some companies aren't investing in integrated evidence planning. What would you say are kind of some of the reasons behind that? Is it just down to the size of the organization, trade-off risk? What's your thinking there?
There could be many reasons why an organization might not pursue an integrated evidence plan. One might be just a lack of familiarity with the concept of integrated evidence generation planning, which is still relatively new, although growing quite quickly. The other could be that the organization is stuck in a reactive and kind of urgency driven set of tactics that it negates the opportunity to pause to think strategically about what evidence is needed and how you could work cross functionally to do it. And that's a real mistake, because not only is it inefficient, it misses the opportunity to do something that can be very advantageous to the organization. And what you do is you create risk of contradictory evidence if two functions that do not communicate, that lack line of sight, are driving forward similar research initiatives. Not only are you losing money through that inefficiency, you risk the possibility of generating data that is contradictory, that is opposed, and thus is not interpretable. And we want to keep things clear, we want to keep them purposeful, and we want to provide value. And to do that, you really need to take the time to think about what evidence is needed across the organization, how will it be applied to the different stakeholders, whether they're clinicians, payers, hospital systems, patients, and patient advocates. All need information, and it can be done synergistically rather than many paths in parallel, and the risks that come with that approach.
When I engage with some biopharmaceutical leaders around integrated evidence planning, I think one of the concerns they have is just budgetary constraints. The volume of studies that they envision will come out of an IEP, right? If they're investing in such a document, such a deliverable, will they just get a lot of studies that ultimately they just won't be able to fund because of, XYZ constraints? Now, something that I've been thinking about, and I'd love to get your view on, is it's not necessarily about the volume. It's all about the quality. I mean, you said this earlier in your point, making sure that we solve for the right evidence gaps, right? We get the right data and we get that efficiently. Sometimes just designing a study that is more efficient produces a net saving that is remarkable. So what do you think is like the key determinants of making sure that when you do the IEP, you get the right input to be able to focus critically on, okay, these are our core gaps and these are the studies or study that we need to deliver.
You're absolutely right, Dylan. The best organizations focus on impact and not volume. You don't need 40 studies to run. You need the right 12 studies to run and signal above noise. So the best organizations are asking, will this evidence change guidelines? Will it unlock reimbursement? Will clinicians actually rely on this to make important decisions for patient care? And it's unfortunately the case that many organizations are just pumping volume and noise into the evidence atmosphere. And what we need are really clear, well-run studies that build into a composed scientific narrative that is useful across various external stakeholders. And that's the aim. And the culture will determine that. You need strong leadership to build that expectation, the expectation to collaborate across functions. You don't want individuals feeling like there's a need to compete within a function, or you don't want functions that are competing with each other. You want everyone to have the expectation to work as an enterprise and drive forward the best possible evidence that allows for the success of the organization and the success of the physicians treating their patients for the best possible outcomes. And it takes work, and it takes purposeful strategy and culture to make that happen.
What do you feel like it looks like, within the project to get to the right evidence gaps?
To get to the right evidence gaps, take the time to discuss it as an organization. I think that's absolutely critical. Have leadership that is knowledgeable of integrated evidence and understands the value of taking the time to communicate so that the evidence that you generate is reflective of every functional strategic plan, and that the evidence generation plan is not owned by a singular function within the organization, but is co-owned and created, dynamically revised, and understood across the organization, so that you're not racing forward in different channels without that communication and creating things that are potentially at risk to your organization, as well as at risk, providing risk to the physicians that we're engaging with.
Yeah. And I think in most organizations, they're typically sponsored by medical affairs. But what do you do? As a global medical affairs leader, what do you do to make sure that you institute that co-ownership amongst the cross-functional teams?
Build an informal integrated evidence team or committee so that there is governance and opportunity for communication, because by design, different functional teams will have different strategic imperatives and goals. Clinical teams are going to optimize data for regulatory endpoints, and health economic teams are going to think about payer relevance and access. Medical's thinking about scientific credibility, and commercial is thinking about competitive differentiation. All of this is valid. All of this can be reflected in a singular plan, but it takes work, and it takes an organization that's invested in it, because successful evidence generation planning is probably 10% the right frameworks, 10% the right digital tools, and 80% culture. The opportunity to communicate, to build, and dynamically revise. And then, moreover, what I think is lacking is really taking the time to assess the impact of the evidence you generate. Did it hit its target? Because you're not always perfect, and you don't always know how things will work out in the real world. But you do have the opportunity to study that purposefully and to revise your plan dynamically so that it becomes more and more useful, impactful, valuable across those stakeholders that I mentioned for the reasons that I mentioned.
Yeah, absolutely. I really do want to unpack the dynamic maintenance part of this, but before I do so, just on that cross-functional element, first of all, I think that's a great wisdom in terms of setting up that informal as a key word, but steering committee, so to speak. Everybody has a case for different evidence gaps rising to the top, and I think, as you mentioned, it varies by function, it varies by motive, but what would you say is the art of getting to the highest alignment possible? And we know that success when it comes to evidence gap assessment looks like a the output looks like a force ranked list of evidence gaps, right? First of all, do you agree with that? And secondly, how do you feel like what's the best exercise to get there? Obviously, acknowledging that everybody's got a case for something.
Right. There are numerous ways to engineer an integrated evidence plan, but at the core of it and through whatever means you enact to build an IEP, it's always going to be engaging with clinicians. So really leaning on your field facing colleagues that day in and day out meet with patients, meet with clinicians, meet with payers and health systems, and understand the friction and the barriers to providing great clinical care and getting access for patients. Have those people be front and center in your forum for building the IEP. Have a very frank discussion, putting all the evidence gaps on the board. And think about, is this an evidence gap that is meaningful with respect to driving an outcome? Or is this an unknown that that isn't constructive or isn't going to make a difference when it comes to clinical care? So there's an element of prioritization. Once you have a clear view of where evidence is needed and why, you can begin to integrate those evidence gaps into cohesive and impactful study concepts. And I think that's a critical next step, is taking the forum for discussion and translating evidence gaps into pragmatic exercises, studies of really any sort of design, whatever it might be, to get to the evidence gap and address it, and to find the right partners, the right teams. And I mentioned co-ownership. This is a great opportunity for a study to have a medical lead and a clinical lead and a HEOR lead. And I'm not saying that every individual, every colleague in your organization needs to drive every study, but looking at a study through those different lenses and building the study together ensures that you have the data that ultimately will be used by those colleagues for the ends that you intended. So it's not every organization where this will work, because you have friction, you have budgetary friction, you have functions that are in a competitive spirit that isn't conducive to that sort of collaboration on a study. But that's unfortunate, and that's a barrier to your success, as well as how much value you're going to bring forward for the stakeholders that you care about.
Yeah, I really like what you said there, Andrew, and just kind of picking up on that, like, oftentimes when you're doing those gap assessments, there's oftentimes, especially organizations that are new to this process, there's an extrapolation between what is something that we need to that is an evidence gap where we need to generate evidence around versus what is a communication gap, right? Like there is actually evidence there. It's just about better disseminating it, or what is kind of sits within the realm of the clinical development plan. So I think my question is, when you're producing these IEGPs, how do you manage for that? But then also, how do you think about how they situate themselves against the clinical development plan, the publication plan, so adjacent strategic processes? Like, is there something that you do, or like a way that you kind of set up the team charter to ensure that there's that clarity of division?
I'm not saying that the integrated evidence plan needs to replace any function specific plan, but I do firmly believe that it's something that should be co-owned across the functions of the organization, and that whether you're sitting on the clinical team or market access or medical affairs, you see the imperatives of your function clearly within the integrated evidence plan, and that successful execution of that plan translates into the success of the function, that you meet your aims for the year, which means providing the value that you intended to the stakeholders that you care about. This takes frequent communication, it takes strong relationships, it takes putting the organization and the physician and patients above your own personal success and the success of the function. And for that reason, I think you need strong leadership. This is difficult to do from the bottom up, but
Mhm.
having the right leadership that puts that expectation forward creates that psychological safety for debate, for collaboration, for cross success. Ultimately, that's going to be a successful organization. That's the right culture to drive change. And that's what every organization should be working toward.
Yeah, absolutely, Andrew. And maybe just shifting gears a little bit and thinking about the maintenance of these plans. So in reality, these plans are often refreshed on an annual cadence, right? And it's oftentimes against some governance or budgetary processes that exist within the organization. But as you mentioned earlier, like these theoretically should be, continuous decision ready, living documents, right? There are internal, there are external factors that are changing all the time. So maybe if you can kind of, from your point of view, expand upon what maintenance of an IGP looks like today, but what you feel like, the ideal state of maintenance would look like. I mean, maybe we're not there yet, maybe we are. We'd just kind of love for you to share your perspectives on it.
Yeah, you hit on a really important and challenging subject because it's often the case that colleagues that are driving forward the research projects are often tasked with keeping tabs on the progress of those studies, both within the function and across functions within the organization. And often, and for a good reason, the priority is driving the research forward and generating critical evidence. And what's secondary to that is keeping track of how all of these projects are moving forward. It is still critical, and the way to do it is to, one, ensure that you do have regular summits, workshops, whatever you might want to call it, for cross-functional integrated evidence planning. You could do it quarterly, you could do it biannually, but meet with the key stakeholders across functions. Take stock of what you've accomplished in the prior quarter, the prior year. Take stock of what's happened in the landscape clinically and competitively, and think about how you need to adjust your plan. Where were the studies that you executed successful? Where did you fall short? Why? How could you adapt? So the workshops across the organization is a really important point. It's a really critical opportunity to pause, take consideration, and adapt so that you're strategic and not reactive. Other ways of maintenance are more regular maintenance calls, really, maybe a monthly call where the leaders of studies can join and provide a very quick update on what's changed, what hasn't. Often these aren't the most exciting call, but it's an opportunity for whoever is holding the plan and keeping track of what's progressing and when we could expect data. That's an opportunity to keep that current and keep it accurate. And it is an important point, and it's worthwhile investing in that monthly call just to check on progress. There are digital tools for this, and they're becoming increasingly smarter and easier to use, and some of them rely on AI. But whether your plan sits in a PowerPoint, an Excel or Smartsheet, or a fit for purpose digital dashboard is not the critical aspect. I think the communication and teamwork again is the critical aspect. Keeping communication, allowing time to dynamically shape the plan, and allowing time to keep track of your success. Another component of this, and I think you alluded to it, is how does the IEP fit in the context of other plans? And I said it doesn't replace those plans, and it really does not. What it does is meets your partners in the middle. Very often there's a publication strategy plan, and the publication strategy plan or communications plan relates to when we're putting out abstracts, when we're putting out conferences, which conferences and which studies will come forward. They need to understand the pipeline of data, and they need to think strategically about what will come forward so that it is synergistic, that it's cohesive into a scientific narrative, which is another product that can be created by the organization that very much relies on the IEP, and you can meet those colleagues in the middle. Starting really early in the development of an asset is critical too. So on the other side of meeting in the middle, speak with your clinical development colleagues. Think about how you can begin to generate evidence that builds value for the asset that you're bringing forward and developing. Maybe that means greater awareness of the disease clinically. Maybe it means new diagnostic screening measures to find patients and find them sooner. Maybe it means understanding the competitive landscape and how the asset that you're driving forward will differentiate. I never think it's too soon to begin those conversations and starting to generate evidence. So kind of meeting in the middle on the front side.
Yeah, absolutely, Andrew. And speaking of kind of keeping these documents maintained, I think you're absolutely right. Like the net outcome that we're driving towards is communication and alignment, right? There is a digitization element as it comes into actually generating the IGP now. Like how can we leverage digital tools to better surface the appropriate evidence gaps, better think about the endpoints attached to the studies for those gaps, and will it make an impact in the claims that we're able to say about the treatment or the disease state. I kind of just wanted to close out by, getting your view on, given the fact that you have been so instrumental in championing IGPs at a host of organizations and are really at the cusp of what's happening in terms of their evolution. What do you feel like the next wave of IGPs look like? Like what will IGPs look like in 5 years from now? Would really love to get your viewpoint on that.
Yeah, it's exciting. I think I can say that I've been at several organizations now that have developed their own large language model or are using AI, ML, and large language models to do things more efficiently, to gather more information in a second than it would take without these tools. So leaning on AI and large language models to source data gaps, to validate assumptions, to work as efficiently as possible is a really exciting opportunity that I've seen starting to bear fruit. Another part is once you generate the plan and once you start producing data from the studies that comprise the plan, that information can be part of the model itself so that individuals across your organization can access information like that just by asking your enterprise ChatGPT, do we have a study on this, or what data have we produced? What are our competitors producing? And that could be a really powerful tool. So I think that's very exciting. I'm a big fan of digital dashboards. I like data visualization. I think having a well-designed dashboard can provide instantaneous information without having to thumb through lots of different PowerPoints and Excel. So I think it's worthwhile to build and share a dashboard in which your plan is reflected, the studies that are active are reflected, and your progress. And this helps with meeting your internal partners in the middle, helps them prepare for their engagements in the field, and it helps align the organization. It solves for the issue of having a million different plans in different teams and SharePoint folders. It's try to work towards something singular that is current. And yes, it takes investment and it takes time, but I think that it'll become easier and easier and it's worthwhile. Perhaps the last thing that I would love to see is more integration of what is the output of the plan itself. So, did you execute the studies and did the evidence impact decision making in the way that you intended? Did the studies impact clinical care in the way you intended? What could you learn from success and from failure? And how do you build that back cyclically and systematically into the plan itself? And I'm very excited to see IEPs becoming more established and widespread across the industry. And I'm excited to see the sharing of best practices and the evolution of how we do this and do it well, and the changing of culture that allows for that sort of collaboration that ultimately is in everyone's best interest.
Well, Andrew, look, we're so pleased to have you join us on the podcast today. Your passion and your expertise really shines through. So just want to first of all thank you for the time, but secondly, if somebody's listening to this and is looking for a marginal enhancement they can make to their integrated evidence strategy or plan, what's one take home from this conversation you'd like to leave them with?
take the time to approach evidence generation planning systematically and collaboratively across the organization. Doing so will enable your success.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much, Andrew. Enjoy your weekend.
You too. Thank you. Thank you.